Today's video is sponsored by Readly, of whom more later. I recently picked up a copy of a rather curious book that I'd like to share with you. It's an anonymously authored book entitled The Railway Traveller's Handybook, first published in 1862 and reprinted many times subsequently. In fact, I believe it's freely available online these days. This was, as its name implies, a simple guide to travelling by train for people new to this form of transport. It's a fascinating insight both into train travel at the time, but also into how the Victorians viewed trains. Of course, the Victorian era was a long time. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837 and died in 1901. Railway technology evolved a lot over that period. The first mainline railway opened in 1830, and by the beginning of the 20th century most of Britain was covered by railway lines. The passenger coaches of the 1830s were primitive things. The third-class coaches were little better than goods wagons, sometimes not even having seats. But by the 1900s, coaches were far more comfortable, well-sprung and riding on four-wheeled bogies. The position in 1862 was, to put it simply, that we were getting the hang of things. Many of the main lines of Britain were in place. One could reach all of the major towns and cities by train. The railways were established enough to provide grand terminal stations and hotels. There were such things as regular train travellers. But the boom in commuting that characterises the majority of train travel today hadn't happened yet. In fact, the first underground railway wouldn't open until the following year. In short, unless you lived in the suburbs of a major city that happened to have a railway, there was a good chance that you would never have travelled by train. And that's the market the book was aimed at. It's hard to fully comprehend how much of a revolution train travel provided. Before the railways, the only way to travel long distance was by stagecoach, which could take days. Coach travel was uncomfortable and unsafe, with the poor condition of roads and the prevalence of bandits. The idea that one could travel from, say, London to York within a day must have seemed like fantasy. Many people found the early trains frightening. It didn't help that coach companies fought back with propaganda emphasising the real and imagined risks of rail travel. The Railway Traveller's Handybook, in some ways, doesn't help matters. An absurd number of the tips provided are, basically, about how not to die. In reality, the risks were relatively low. The reason there were so many reports on accidents was because the railways were far more closely monitored and tightly regulated than stagecoaches. You just didn't hear about the accidents on the stagecoaches. So a lot of the advice comes across as fairly hysterical, if not outright wrong. There's an anecdote about an elderly gentleman accustomed to travel between London and Brighton who is seized by what sounds like chronic migraines. His doctor determines, and I quote, that the performance of a journey of 100 miles within so short a space of time and at such a rapid pace had too greatly excited the nervous system. There is a lot of advice on accidents. In those days, first-class carriages were far more padded than other classes, so our author advises a first-class ticket for the best protection in the event of a collision. He also advises travelling in the middle coaches for the same reason. He points out that while travelling at speed is frightening, it is safer because the locomotive will likely be able to plough through obstacles unscathed. I cannot emphasise enough how wrong this is. A lot of the advice is useful stuff, to be fair, like how to buy your ticket, how to pack your bags, and how to avoid missing your train. There's also information that's very useful to enthusiasts, things like signalling and whistle codes. There's a lot of advice on what to do during your journey, and this is my favourite non-death related section of the book. Essential for the journey are a rug, cap, cushion, and ideally a pair of sunglasses. Chess and cards are both means of passing the time recommended by the author, though he warns that you should watch out for card sharps who apparently routinely frequented long-distance trains. On trains possessed of a smoking carriage, he suggests smoking as a means of passing the time. He has a lot to say about reading, and that brings us on to today's sponsor, Readly. Reading, says the guide, is an exhaustless fund of recreation. Ample provision is made on every railway bookstall along the line of literature in every variety of form. I personally always like to have something to read on a long journey. Well, Readly offers more variety than even the best stocked bookstall of 1862. It's an app that gives you access to literally thousands of newspapers and magazines on all sorts of subjects, which is just what you need on a long train journey. I can catch up on all my favourite train magazines and more besides for a fraction of what I'd pay for the print editions. And I don't have to think about how much space they'll take up in my bags. You can totally ignore the handybook's advice on carefully picking your literature, because Readly gives you everything on a single device, including back issues, for a single excellent value monthly subscription fee. The guide advises that if you're travelling with other people, you should all get a different periodical so you can swap. But Readly has them beat on that too. A single Readly account can be shared with up to 6 people. The anonymous author suggests that you should hold your reading matter in both hands, which, he says, will impart an elasticity and aplomb to the magazine. Well, I don't know about that, but Readly can be used on any device, so really how you hold it is up to you. I do like to hold my phone with aplomb, but that's just me. Oh, and one more thing. Viewers of this channel get 2 months free. All you have to do is click the link in the description below. You need never get bored on a journey ever again. The handy book has much to say on the subject of conversation, and honestly I think it's worth quoting the first paragraph in full. With regard to conversation, the English are notoriously deficient in this art. Generally speaking, the occupants of the railway carriage perform the whole journey in silence. But if one passenger be more loquaciously inclined than the rest, he is soon silenced by abrupt or tart replies, or by a species of grunt expressive of dissent or dissatisfaction. The author goes on to complain, why should an Englishman be ever like a ghost in not speaking until he is spoken to? That being said, he does have advice on etiquette. One should steer clear of politics and religion, very wise. And he states that one should never make the mistake of assuming that just because you've become travelling companions, that means you're now friends. He speaks of the awkward incident when one Mr. G and Lord B met on holiday and became well acquainted over the course of a week, only for Mr. G to make the horrible faux pas of greeting Lord B on Bond Street 6 months later, which apparently was very embarrassing for all concerned. I'll take his word for it. The author suggests that in choosing your compartment you might save yourself a lot of trouble by using the pseudoscience of physiognomy to determine which fellow passengers are likely to provide pleasant company. I don't know, I think if a guy came at me with a pair of calipers when I was trying to read, he'd be the passenger to avoid. There is a section on sending unaccompanied children by rail and also unaccompanied women. Apparently, you should enlist the services of a group of women, ideally of matronly appearance. His words, not mine. This was the era before buffet cars or at-seat refreshment, so the only way to get food and drink on your journey was to leap out of the train at the station, run to the refreshment room, get what you wanted, and run back before your train left again. The whole thing sounds pretty hellish, quite a scrum. Apparently you should know exactly where the refreshment room is in advance, get there as quickly as possible, order what you want, preferably using a single word, and hand over the exact change in the hope of not missing out in the scramble. On the whole, I think I'd prefer to pack sandwiches, which is the author's preferred course of action. Interestingly, I don't know if this was the case in the 1860s, but I found this sign in a Great Western Railway carriage at Didcot, advertising that the company could do you a nice hamper, which sounds rather civilized. There is more advice on surviving train crashes. He says that you should throw yourself on the floor if you sense that a crash is impending. This is actually still pretty decent advice, although you're liable to look quite the fool if your instincts are wrong. He has much to say on the dangers of wearing a top hat. Apparently the brim could act like a knife in the event of its wearer suddenly being jerked forward. It's all a bit crazy. The way this guy talks about it, you'd think it was a miracle anyone survived travelling by rail at all. Things have, of course, changed a lot since the 1860s. The railway network in Britain would continue to grow. So much so that eventually they'd feel the need to prune it back. Millions of people commute by rail every day, and the journeys are considerably faster. Train and station facilities continue to improve, driven by technology. People quite regularly travel across the country without suffering migraines or being mutilated by top hats. But at least we still haven't got the hang of conversation on trains. We are British, after all. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, as well as here on YouTube, for your support. You are the hot soup to my refreshment room. I would also like to thank Readly for their sponsorship. Check out the link in the description below. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.